A rancher lived alone for years, until a mail-order Apache showed up at his door. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's tale. A lone rancher named Jacob Hayes had spent years living in solitude. After the tragic loss of his wife and child in a brutal winter storm, Jacob sought refuge in the wide, empty stretches of land, far from the noise and chaos of the world. His home, a small cabin perched on the outskirts of a desolate valley, was his sanctuary. The air here was crisp, the wind constant, and the landscape unyielding. A man of few words, Jacob found comfort in the routine of ranch life. He spent his days tending to his cattle, fixing fences, and occasionally hunting for food. Despite the vast emptiness around him, there was a quiet peace in the isolation. That peace, however, was about to be shattered in a way he never could have anticipated. One cold morning, as the sun barely began to rise over the distant hills, a small package arrived at Jacob's cabin. It was unexpected, and more importantly, it was not the usual mail delivery. He opened it cautiously, wondering what it could be. Inside, he found a letter, sealed with a faded red wax stamp. The handwriting on the front was elegant and precise. Jacob read the letter carefully, his brow furrowing with confusion. It was a request for help, though not for the typical things one might expect in such a remote place. The letter, in broken English, explained that a woman named Amelia had been sent to him via a mail-order service. She was described as an Apache woman, trained in the arts of survival and seeking refuge in the wilds of the West. Jacob had heard of such services before, mail-order brides, desperate women seeking new lives, but this was different. There was no mention of a marriage contract or anything of that sort. Instead, the letter simply asked for Jacob's protection. It seemed absurd at first. He lived in isolation for a reason. He wasn't interested in hosting anyone, least of all a stranger. But something about the letter tugged at him. Perhaps it was the notion of protecting someone who had nowhere else to turn. Or maybe it was the mystery behind this woman's arrival. Whatever it was, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to face a decision that would change his life forever. Later that day, as the shadows began to stretch across the land, a figure appeared at his doorstep. She was tall, wearing a worn but sturdy cloak, and carrying a bundle. Her dark eyes met Jacob's, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The wind howled around them, but it felt like time itself had stopped. She was exactly as described in the letter, a woman of Apache descent, strong and confident, but with a sense of vulnerability hidden beneath the surface. Amelia stepped forward, breaking the silence. "I'm Amelia," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm here because I need your help." Jacob hesitated for a moment. This wasn't what he had expected. But something about her presence, something in the way she spoke, made him realize that his solitary life was about to be turned upside down. He nodded slowly, stepping aside to let her in. He didn't know it yet, but this encounter would mark the beginning of a new chapter in both of their lives, one filled with unexpected twists, trials, and, perhaps, redemption. Jacob stepped aside as Amelia entered his cabin, her presence filling the small space with an unfamiliar energy. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the faint smell of damp earth, remnants of the storm that had passed earlier that morning. As she closed the door behind her, Amelia looked around the modest cabin, her eyes lingering on the simple furnishings. Jacob watched her carefully, still unsure of what to make of her sudden appearance. She looked tired, her face worn by the hardships she had undoubtedly endured, yet there was a quiet strength in her posture that caught his attention. Amelia set her bundle down by the hearth and turned to face him. "I didn't mean to trouble you," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I only asked for shelter for a while, just until I can figure things out." Jacob nodded slowly, still processing the situation. He had lived alone for years, content with his solitude, but there was something in Amelia's eyes that made him feel compelled to help her. She was different from the usual strangers that wandered through his land. There was a weight to her presence, a sense that she had seen much more of the world than she let on. He hesitated before speaking. "What brings you to my door, Amelia?" he asked, his voice low. Amelia looked down for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts before speaking. "I've been running," she began, her voice quiet, almost as if speaking to herself. "Running from a past that's too dangerous to face alone." Jacob could see the pain in her eyes as she spoke, the scars of her journey written clearly on her face. "You came all the way out here, to this part of the country, to escape?" he asked, trying to understand. Amelia nodded. "I was born into a life of violence," she said, her words tinged with bitterness. "My family was caught in the middle of a war that never seemed to end. I grew up learning to survive, but I wasn't prepared for what happened." Jacob waited, giving her the space to continue. "After my father died, I had no choice but to leave," she said. "I ended up here, hoping for a fresh start, but the world has a way of following you. I thought coming out here would keep me safe. But even out here, I can't escape my past." There was a long silence between them as Jacob processed her words. He had no idea what kind of life Amelia had lived, but he could feel the weight of her experiences. She wasn't just a woman in need of shelter. She was someone running from something far worse than the isolation he had chosen. "You're safe here," Jacob finally said, his voice firm. "For as long as you need, you'll be safe." Amelia looked up at him, her expression softening slightly, though her eyes still carried a trace of the fear that had driven her here. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know where else to turn." Jacob nodded, still unsure of the full story, but something told him that this wasn't just a simple case of someone needing shelter from a storm. Amelia was running from something much darker, something that had followed her all the way out here. As the evening wore on, the two of them sat in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that Amelia's arrival was no coincidence. It felt as if something had been set in motion long before she had arrived at his door, something that would change the course of both their lives. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, the sound eerie in the stillness of the night. Amelia stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the vast wilderness beyond. Jacob watched her, a sense of unease creeping over him. What was she really running from? And more importantly, what would happen when the past caught up to her? As the days passed, Jacob began to notice something strange. Amelia had settled into the rhythm of life on the ranch, but there was always an air of tension around her. She never spoke much about her past, and though she had begun to help with the daily chores, there were moments when her eyes would cloud over, as if the weight of something heavy was pulling at her from the inside. Jacob respected her silence, but he could feel the unspoken questions hanging in the air. What was she running from? And why had she come all this way to his doorstep? One morning, as Jacob worked on repairing a fence near the edge of his property, he saw Amelia walking toward him. She was carrying a bundle of firewood, her posture straight, her steps purposeful. There was something different about her today. Her usual cautious demeanor had been replaced with a look of determination. She stopped just short of him, her eyes meeting his with a seriousness he hadn't seen before. "I need to talk," she said quietly. Jacob put down his tools and wiped his hands on his worn jeans, sensing that this conversation would be different from the others. "What's on your mind?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Amelia took a deep breath before speaking. "I don't want to put you in danger, Jacob," she said, her voice low but urgent. "But there are people looking for me. People I can't escape." Jacob's heart skipped a beat. He had known that there was something more to her story, but hearing her finally speak of it made everything feel more real. "Who are they?" Jacob asked, his tone serious now. Amelia hesitated for a moment, glancing around as if checking to make sure no one was watching. "They are men from my past," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was involved with a group of traitors. They were ruthless, and when I tried to leave, they made sure I couldn't." Jacob's eyes narrowed. "What do they want with you?" Amelia's eyes filled with pain as she spoke. "They want something I took, something valuable, and they won't stop until they get it back." Jacob's mind raced. He had been living alone for so long, avoiding any kind of trouble, but now, it seemed trouble had come to his doorstep. "What exactly did you take?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with curiosity. Amelia swallowed hard, then pulled out a small leather pouch from her pocket. She opened it carefully, revealing a small, intricate piece of silver jewelry. The pendant gleamed in the morning light, its design simple yet elegant. "This," she said softly, "this is what they want." Jacob studied the pendant for a moment, his brow furrowing. He couldn't understand why something so small could be worth so much trouble, but the look in Amelia's eyes told him it was more than just a trinket. "It's beautiful," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's just a necklace, right?" Amelia shook her head slowly. "No, it's a key. A key to something much larger than either of us understands." Jacob stared at the pendant, a sense of unease growing in his chest. "So what now?" he asked. Amelia met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "We have to get away," she said, her voice firm. "We can't stay here. They'll find us." Jacob looked at the land around them, the sprawling ranch, the endless stretches of wilderness. It had always been his sanctuary, but now it felt like a trap. "I don't know if we can outrun them," he said quietly. "But I'll protect you, Amelia. I promise you that." Amelia's eyes softened, and for the first time since she had arrived, she allowed herself to smile, albeit weakly. "Thank you, Jacob. I don't know what I would have done without you." Jacob nodded, his mind already working. He knew that the peace he had built here was about to be shattered. But what choice did he have? Amelia was in danger, and he was the only one who could help her. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the land, Jacob felt a sense of resolve settle in his chest. This was no longer just about protecting a stranger. It was about standing up to a past that had come crashing into his life and making sure it didn't take away the future he had worked so hard to build. The storm was coming, and there was no running from it. Jacob and Amelia spent the next few days preparing for what was to come. Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, and as much as he tried to push that thought aside, every creak of the cabin or rustling of the wind made his senses jump. Amelia, too, seemed more alert than usual, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, her movements sharp and purposeful. It was clear that she was no stranger to danger. Jacob had been living in isolation for years, keeping to himself and avoiding any conflicts, but now it felt like the world he had turned his back on was catching up to him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Amelia spoke again, her voice low but urgent. "We need to leave tonight," she said, her gaze never leaving the window. "The longer we stay here, the more likely it is they'll find us." Jacob nodded, his mind racing. They had already packed what little they could carry, and the horses were ready. He had lived his whole life avoiding confrontation, but now, the need to protect Amelia and escape the shadows of her past had become his new reality. "Are you sure?" Jacob asked, his voice steady despite the fear that was beginning to settle in his gut. Amelia turned to him, her eyes meeting his with an intensity he hadn't seen before. "I'm sure," she replied, her voice unwavering. "I've seen the way they operate. They won't stop, but we can still outrun them if we move quickly." With a heavy heart, Jacob grabbed his rifle and slung it over his shoulder. He glanced around the cabin one last time, taking in the solitude that had been his refuge for so long. But that peace was gone now, replaced by a sense of urgency he couldn't ignore. They didn't have much time. The night air was cold as they mounted their horses and rode out, the darkness swallowing them whole. Jacob kept his eyes trained on the path ahead, his hand resting lightly on the reins, feeling every muscle in his body tense. Amelia, riding just behind him, was silent, her gaze fixed on the horizon. They moved swiftly through the wilderness, their horses' hooves muffled by the soft earth beneath them. The sounds of the night surrounded them, an owl's hoot in the distance, the rustle of leaves in the trees, but in the silence between them, there was a tension that made Jacob's skin crawl. They rode for hours, the full moon casting long shadows across the land. The terrain became more difficult as they ventured further into the hills, the path growing steeper and the brush thicker. Jacob's mind raced as they moved deeper into unfamiliar territory. He had never ventured this far from his ranch, and he knew the risk they were taking. But he also knew there was no turning back. The sounds of hooves pounding behind them kept him alert. He didn't know if it was his imagination, but it felt like they were being followed. Amelia didn't speak much during the ride, but Jacob could sense her unease. She, too, was aware of the danger closing in on them. As the hours passed, the chill of the night began to settle in, and Jacob's thoughts drifted back to the pendant Amelia had shown him. He had yet to fully understand what it meant or why it was so important, but he knew it had something to do with the people chasing her. They couldn't afford to be caught, and yet, Jacob felt a growing sense of dread with each passing mile. The farther they went, the more they seemed to be entering a land that belonged to someone else. He could feel it in the air. The land was different here, more unforgiving, as though the earth itself was warning them to turn back. But they couldn't stop now. Amelia's past was catching up to them, and there was nothing left to do but keep moving forward. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, but eventually, the sounds of pursuit grew quieter, the weight of danger lifting slightly. Jacob allowed himself a brief moment to relax, but he knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Amelia was still running, and he was still protecting her. They rode through the night, the moon above guiding their way, but both of them knew that whatever lay ahead, they were no longer alone. They had each other now, and together, they would face whatever came next. The morning light began to break through the trees, painting the landscape in shades of orange and gold. Jacob slowed his horse as they reached a small clearing, a quiet moment to pause and reassess. He turned to Amelia, her face shadowed by the hood of her cloak, her expression unreadable. "We'll rest here for a while," Jacob said softly, his voice hoarse from the ride. Amelia nodded, but there was no relief in her eyes. The journey was far from over, and both of them knew it. As the morning light filtered through the trees, Jacob and Amelia sat quietly by their horses, taking the first real rest they had since leaving the cabin. The tension that had gripped them both during the long ride hadn't entirely faded, but the brief moment of peace allowed them to catch their breath. Jacob could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They had barely made it through the night without being caught, but now, with the day ahead of them, the danger still loomed large. Amelia's eyes were distant, lost in thought as she gazed out into the wilderness, her face shadowed by the hood of her cloak. Jacob could tell that she wasn't just weary from the ride. There was something else weighing on her. "We need to keep moving," Jacob said, his voice low and serious, breaking the silence between them. Amelia looked at him, nodding slowly. "I know," she replied, her voice flat, the urgency in her words carrying a sense of finality. "But I can't keep running forever, Jacob. Sooner or later, they will find me." Jacob turned to face her, his expression hardening. He had known this all along, but hearing her speak it out loud made the reality of their situation even more apparent. "We'll keep moving as long as we can," he said, his tone firm. "But we'll also fight back if it comes to that. I won't let them take you." Amelia's eyes softened, and for the first time since their journey began, she allowed herself a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You don't know what it means to me that you're here." Jacob gave her a reassuring nod before standing up, his muscles sore from the long hours of riding. The sun had risen higher, casting a golden glow across the land. He looked around, taking in their surroundings. They had made it further than he had expected, but he knew they couldn't stop here. Not yet. They needed to get to higher ground, to a place where they could make a stand if necessary. As they mounted their horses again, Jacob's thoughts raced. He knew that Amelia's past was dangerous, and the men who were chasing her were ruthless. What worried him most was the uncertainty of what would happen when they inevitably caught up with them. Would they be able to outrun them again? Or would this be the end of their journey? They rode through the forest, the silence between them growing heavier as the hours passed. Jacob's mind was clouded with doubts, but he kept them to himself. Amelia was in danger, and he had made a promise to protect her. That was all that mattered now. As they reached the edge of the forest, Jacob's heart sank. He saw movement in the distance, men on horseback, riding fast, and coming their way. They were too far to make out any details, but Jacob's gut told him it was them, the men who had been following them. Amelia's face paled as she saw the riders approaching. "They found us," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jacob's hand instinctively went to his rifle, his grip tightening. He had known this day would come, but the reality of it hit him harder than he expected. They were about to face the people Amelia had been running from, and he wasn't sure if they were ready for what lay ahead. "Get behind me," Jacob ordered, his voice low and commanding. Amelia nodded, her eyes wide with fear, but filled with determination. Jacob urged his horse forward, moving toward a small rise in the land that would give him the high ground. The riders were still several hundred yards away, but Jacob knew they wouldn't wait much longer to close the distance. He had to be ready. As the riders grew closer, Jacob could see their faces, men with hard expressions, their clothes worn and patched from years of rough living. They weren't just regular travelers. These men were bounty hunters, or worse. They had a look of desperation about them, and Jacob knew that meant they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. "Amelia," Jacob said, glancing over his shoulder. "Stay low and stay quiet. I'll handle this." Amelia's gaze locked with his, and for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through passed between them in silence. She nodded once, her face set in a mask of determination. Jacob turned his attention back to the riders. He wasn't sure how many there were, but he knew it didn't matter. They had to make it through this, no matter the cost. As the riders came into view, Jacob's hand tightened around the reins, ready for whatever would come next. This was the moment he had been preparing for. It was time to face the danger head-on and protect the woman who had come into his life so unexpectedly. The riders were nearly upon them now, their horses kicking up dirt as they rode with purpose. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. He had no choice but to stand his ground and fight. Amelia was depending on him, and he would not let her down. The riders were now only a few yards away, their horses kicking up dust as they moved in swiftly, their eyes fixed on Jacob and Amelia. Jacob's heart raced, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on him. His rifle was ready, but he knew that once the first shot was fired, everything would change. He had only one chance to make this right, to protect Amelia from the men who had chased her across the wilderness. Amelia, now crouched low behind Jacob, gripped her own rifle tightly, her fingers trembling. She had been trained in combat, but she hadn't fought in years. She wasn't sure what she would be able to do against these men, but she knew she had to stay ready. The lead rider, a tall man with a rough, weathered face, pulled his horse to a stop just a few feet from Jacob. His eyes were hard, narrowed with malice, and his hand rested on the pommel of his saddle. "You've got something that belongs to us," he said, his voice cold and demanding. Jacob stood firm, his body tense. "I don't have anything that belongs to you," he replied evenly, his gaze fixed on the rider. The man laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that made Jacob's skin crawl. "Don't play dumb with me," the rider sneered. "We know who you are, and we know who she is. Now, hand over the necklace, and we'll be on our way. Make this easy for everyone." Jacob's mind raced. He knew that Amelia's necklace was the key to everything, but he didn't fully understand what made it so valuable. What he did understand was that these men weren't interested in bargaining. They wanted the necklace, and they would take it by force if necessary. Amelia's eyes flicked to Jacob, and for the briefest moment, their gazes locked. It was a silent understanding between them. Jacob knew that they couldn't give up the necklace. Not now. Not ever. "You're not taking it," Jacob said, his voice steady, his rifle still aimed at the leader. The man's eyes flashed with anger, and he reached for his gun. But before he could draw, Jacob fired. The shot rang out, loud and sharp, and the leader fell back, his hand still clutching at the saddle as he hit the ground. The other riders reacted immediately, pulling their own weapons and turning their horses toward Jacob. The air was thick with the tension of impending violence. Jacob's heart pounded as he quickly reloaded, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. He had always been a man of the land, not a fighter, but in that moment, he was ready to protect the woman he had come to care for. Amelia, reacting with instinct, fired her rifle as well, hitting one of the riders who had tried to circle behind them. The man fell from his horse, his body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. But there were still 3 more riders, and they were closing in fast. Jacob fired again, hitting another rider in the shoulder. The man cried out in pain, his horse bucking wildly as he tried to regain control. But the remaining 2 riders weren't backing down. They charged forward, their horses kicking up dirt as they came at Jacob and Amelia. Jacob could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins, his every move focused on survival. He fired again, his shot, taking out one of the riders. Only one remained now, but he was determined. The last rider, a shorter man with a scar running down the side of his face, spurred his horse forward, raising his rifle to fire. But before he could, Amelia moved. In a flash, she was on her feet, rushing toward the man with a speed Jacob hadn't expected. She tackled him off his horse, her body slamming into his with enough force to knock the wind from his lungs. The 2 of them struggled on the ground, the man's rifle slipping from his grasp as they fought for control. Amelia's training kicked in, and with a quick move, she pinned him to the ground, her hands wrapping around his throat. Jacob watched in shock as Amelia, despite her size, overpowered the man with ease. She was strong, fierce, and more capable than he had realized. The man gasped for air, his face turning red as he struggled beneath her. Jacob approached, his rifle still raised, but he didn't fire. Amelia had it under control. Slowly, the man stopped fighting, his body going limp beneath her. She stood, breathing heavily, her face hard with the resolve of someone who had faced death too many times to be afraid now. Jacob lowered his rifle, the tension slowly leaving his body. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice rough. Amelia nodded, wiping the sweat from her brow. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady. "But we're not out of danger yet." Jacob nodded, his mind already working on their next move. The battle was over for now, but the danger was far from gone. They had to keep moving, keep surviving. They couldn't stop. Not yet. The sound of the wind howling through the trees seemed to echo louder after the battle. Jacob and Amelia stood there, catching their breath, their bodies still tense from the chaos that had just unfolded. They had won this skirmish, but Jacob knew it wasn't the end. The danger wasn't over. He glanced over at Amelia, who was still catching her breath, her eyes scanning the horizon with the same wariness that had been present since the moment she had arrived at his cabin. "We can't stay here long," she said, her voice low but steady. Jacob nodded in agreement. "We'll keep moving. We need to get to higher ground." He knew the land better than anyone. He'd spent years learning every inch of it, and right now, higher ground was their best bet. They needed to see anyone coming from a distance. "Let's go," Jacob said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. They mounted their horses, the weight of what had just happened still hanging between them. The riders they had just fought off would likely return with more men, and they couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. As they rode, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The land had a way of speaking to him, and every rustle in the brush, every echo of a distant hoofbeat, made his instincts flare. They were not alone. They rode for hours, the only sounds the rhythm of their horses' hooves and the occasional call of a bird in the distance. Amelia, despite her usual calm demeanor, seemed just as tense as Jacob. Her eyes never stopped moving, her grip on her reins tight. She was on edge, but Jacob didn't blame her. They were in unfamiliar territory, and there was no telling what kind of danger was lurking just beyond the next ridge. As they neared the edge of a small valley, Jacob raised his hand, signaling for Amelia to stop. He could see something in the distance, a cloud of dust, rising up from the ground. "Someone's coming," Jacob muttered. Amelia's face hardened. "How many?" "Too many," Jacob said, his voice grim. "We don't have time to outrun them." He glanced around, quickly scanning the terrain. There was a narrow pass up ahead, a place where the land was steep on both sides. It was their best chance to make a stand. "We make our stand there," Jacob said. Amelia didn't hesitate. "Let's move." They spurred their horses forward, racing toward the narrow pass. Jacob's heart raced, not from fear, but from the adrenaline coursing through him. They were going to fight again, and this time, it had to be different. They reached the pass just as the riders appeared over the ridge, their horses moving fast, kicking up dust behind them. Jacob didn't waste time. He pulled out his rifle and quickly positioned himself at the base of the pass, behind a large rock. Amelia did the same, taking cover on the opposite side. The riders were getting closer. Jacob could see their faces now, the same men from earlier. But there were more of them this time, at least 6, maybe more. They were spread out, coming at them from different angles. Jacob's mind raced as he tried to figure out how to handle this. They couldn't fight them all, not with the numbers they had. "Get ready," Jacob whispered to Amelia. She gave him a quick nod, her eyes narrowing. "I'm ready." The first rider came into view, moving fast, his horse charging straight for Jacob. Jacob fired, the shot ringing out loud and clear. The rider tumbled from his horse, a spray of dust and blood marking the spot where he fell. The other riders pulled back, momentarily stunned. But they quickly recovered, spurring their horses forward in a coordinated attack. Jacob and Amelia fired again, taking out another rider. The battle was on. The sound of gunfire echoed through the valley as Jacob and Amelia fought for their lives. They were outnumbered, but they had the high ground, and that gave them an advantage. Jacob fired again, hitting another rider square in the chest. The man fell, but his horse kept going, its hooves thundering as it ran past them. Amelia was moving with precision, her shots steady and true. She hit one of the riders in the shoulder, knocking him off his horse, but there was no time to celebrate. The battle wasn't over yet. As the last rider charged toward them, Jacob took a deep breath, aiming carefully. He fired once more, and the rider fell, his body crumpling to the ground with a sickening thud. The valley fell silent. Jacob and Amelia stood there, panting, their hearts still racing from the chaos. They had won, but it had come at a cost. The danger was far from over. Jacob knew they couldn't stay here much longer. They had to keep moving. He turned to Amelia, his voice low but resolute. "Let's go. We have to get to the next ridge." Amelia nodded, her face grim but determined. They rode off into the distance, leaving behind the bodies of the men who had come to take Amelia. But Jacob knew that this victory wouldn't last long. There would be more battles ahead, and they would be ready. They had been riding for hours, the landscape changing as they made their way deeper into the wilderness. Jacob's eyes remained alert, scanning every ridge, every shadow. The fight they had just survived felt like a distant memory, but the threat was still real, lurking just beyond their reach. The sun had started to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows over the rugged terrain, and Jacob knew they needed to find shelter before nightfall. Amelia had been quiet for the most part, her mind clearly elsewhere. Jacob understood. After all, she had been running for so long, and now, with the blood of the men chasing her on her hands, her past was finally catching up to her. Jacob wasn't sure how much longer they could keep going, but he knew they had to. The danger was relentless, and it wouldn't stop until they did. "We need to find a place to rest for the night," Jacob said, his voice low but firm. Amelia nodded, her expression unreadable. "There's a small cabin a few miles west of here," she replied, her voice steady. "I stayed there once for a while. It's not much, but it's safe." Jacob glanced at her, his curiosity piqued. "You've been here before?" he asked. Amelia hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I have. It's a remote place. No one comes around." Jacob considered her words carefully. They couldn't afford to waste time, but the idea of a safe place, even if only for a night, was tempting. "Let's head that way then," Jacob said. "We'll stop, get some rest, and figure out our next move." The two of them rode on in silence, the weight of the day's events heavy on their shoulders. Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every now and then, he would glance over his shoulder, but each time, there was nothing but the distant hills and the empty expanse of the land. It didn't make sense. They had outrun their pursuers, but the sensation of being hunted was all too real. The hours passed slowly as they made their way through the dense woods, the forest closing in around them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they arrived at the cabin. It was small, weathered, and hidden away in a clearing, surrounded by thick trees that obscured it from view. Jacob dismounted first, leading his horse toward the cabin. Amelia followed, her steps light but purposeful. The cabin was modest, nothing more than a few walls and a roof, with a small stone fireplace in the corner. It was old, the wood gray and weathered, but it was sturdy enough. "This will do," Jacob said, walking inside and glancing around. It wasn't much, but it was a temporary refuge. Amelia took a deep breath, letting the air settle in her lungs. For the first time in days, she felt a brief sense of relief. It wasn't safe here, but it was better than being out in the open, exposed. "I'll make a fire," Jacob said, heading toward the hearth. Amelia nodded, then sank down onto the small cot in the corner, closing her eyes for a moment. The weight of the journey, the endless days of running, and the violent encounters had taken their toll. She had been fighting, surviving. But now, with the briefest moment of peace, she felt the exhaustion settle deep in her bones. Jacob busied himself with gathering firewood and starting a small fire in the hearth. The crackle of the flames was soothing, a small comfort in the otherwise quiet night. They both sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts. Jacob couldn't help but wonder what had brought Amelia to this point. She had been so calm, so composed in the face of everything they had encountered, but he knew there was more to her story than she was willing to share. He didn't press her, though. He had his own ghosts, his own past that he wasn't ready to talk about. The fire flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Jacob stared into the flames, his mind racing. They couldn't stay here long. The men who had been chasing Amelia would come for her. That much was certain. The question was, how much time did they have before the next battle? How many more times could they outrun their enemies? Amelia broke the silence, her voice soft but steady. Jacob, thank you, she said, her words unexpected. For everything. For helping me. Jacob turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. You don't have to thank me, he replied. I made a promise. I'll keep it. Amelia's eyes met his, and for a moment, there was no fear in her gaze, only a quiet understanding. She nodded slowly. I know, she said, but I need you to know it means more than you think. Jacob said nothing, only nodding in return. They were in this together now, for better or worse. The storm wasn't over, and neither of them knew what the future held, but they would face it side by side, as they had since the beginning. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and in that moment, it almost felt like they were just two people sharing a quiet night. Nothing more, nothing less. But Jacob knew better. The fight was far from over, and the days ahead would be the hardest yet. The following morning, the first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees, casting a soft glow over the cabin. Jacob woke to the quiet crackling of the dying fire, the embers glowing faintly in the hearth. Amelia was still asleep on the cot, her breathing steady, though her face was tight with the remnants of the struggle they had faced. He stood up slowly, stretching his stiff muscles as he glanced out the window. The world outside seemed peaceful, serene even, but Jacob knew better. The calm was deceptive. They couldn't afford to let their guard down. The riders would come. He had no doubt about that. Jacob grabbed his rifle, checking it one last time before walking over to the door. He paused, glancing back at Amelia. She had become more than just a woman he had promised to protect. She was a part of his life now, a part of something he hadn't realized he needed. A small part of him, buried deep inside, had started to care for her in a way he hadn't allowed himself to care for anyone in years. His own demons had kept him isolated for too long, but Amelia had shaken something loose in him, something that refused to go back into the shadows. As the morning wore on, Jacob decided they couldn't stay another night. They needed to move. They had been too lucky for too long. If they stayed here, they would be caught, and the men chasing Amelia wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. We're leaving, Jacob said, his voice breaking the silence. Amelia stirred on the cot, but didn't wake. Jacob walked over, gently shaking her shoulder. Amelia, we need to go. She blinked awake, her eyes wide and alert as she took in her surroundings. What happened? She asked, sitting up quickly. Jacob gave her a brief look, his expression hard. We've been here too long. It's time to move. Amelia nodded, not needing to ask why. She had known this moment would come. She quickly stood and started gathering her things, her movements quick and purposeful. Jacob watched her for a moment, then turned to get the horses ready. He knew that once they left, there was no going back. The path ahead would be dangerous, but it was the only choice they had. They couldn't stay hidden forever. As they mounted their horses and set off, the land seemed to stretch endlessly before them. Jacob led the way, his mind focused on what lay ahead. They moved swiftly, traveling through thick forests and over open plains. They didn't speak much, both of them lost in their thoughts, each of them knowing the risks they faced. The sound of hooves on the dirt was the only noise that filled the air. It wasn't long before they reached the edge of the valley. Jacob's heart raced. He knew the men chasing them could be anywhere, and they couldn't afford to stop for long. But as they crested a ridge, Jacob saw something that made his heart stop. Another group of riders, this time on the horizon, just visible against the sky. They were coming for them. Amelia's eyes widened as she saw them too. It's them, she whispered, fear creeping into her voice. Jacob's grip tightened on the reins, his mind working quickly. They were too far to outrun, and the terrain here wasn't going to help them. But there was one place nearby, an old cave system he had discovered years ago. It wasn't much, but it was hidden, and if they could get there, they might stand a chance. Follow me, Jacob ordered, his voice sharp. Amelia nodded, and they spurred their horses into motion. They raced across the valley, the wind whipping past them, the riders behind them closing in fast. Jacob's heart pounded, but he kept his focus on the path ahead. They had to make it to the cave, or they wouldn't make it at all. The sound of galloping hooves grew louder as the riders gained on them. Jacob didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. He just kept riding, pushing his horse harder, faster, through the rugged terrain. Finally, they reached the entrance to the cave. Jacob dismounted first, pulling his rifle from the saddle as he quickly scanned the area. Amelia followed, her eyes scanning the horizon. They were safe for the moment, but only for a short while. Stay low, Jacob instructed, moving deeper into the cave, away from the entrance. They would have to wait until the riders passed, and then, when it was safe, they would move again. As they huddled together in the darkness, Amelia's voice broke the silence. "I never wanted this," she said softly. Jacob turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "You didn't ask for any of this," he said, his voice low. "But you're here now, and we'll make sure you get through this." Amelia met his gaze, and for a moment, there was a silent understanding between them. They had both been through hell, but they had each other now. And for that, they would keep fighting. Outside, the sound of the riders slowly faded as they passed by, unaware of the two fugitives hiding just out of sight. Jacob and Amelia sat in the darkness, waiting for the danger to pass. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Jacob felt a glimmer of hope. Together, they would face whatever came next. In this gripping tale of survival and danger, two unlikely companions, Jacob, a lone rancher, and Amelia, a woman on the run, find themselves fighting for their lives in the harsh and unforgiving wilderness. As their journey unfolds, they face ruthless enemies, deep betrayals, and their own personal demons. With every step they take, the tension builds in this fast-paced story filled with moments of courage and redemption. The world of Western stories provides the backdrop for this action-packed narrative, where the bond between Jacob and Amelia grows stronger with each passing challenge. With every gunshot fired and every decision made, they carve a path through danger, determined to survive. In this world of Western stories, nothing is as it seems, and survival comes at a cost. As they continue to face impossible odds, Jacob and Amelia must rely on their wits and each other to make it through. The gripping storyline and complex characters will keep you on the edge of your seat, making this a must-read for fans of Western stories. The tale of Jacob and Amelia is a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the power of perseverance, all set against the raw and rugged beauty of the Western frontier. If you love thrilling Western stories filled with twists, turns, and unforgettable characters, this one is sure to captivate your imagination.